Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are really excited you could join us today for On Healing the Trauma of Caste. My name is Alex Elliott. I am the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university located in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those who were forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS public programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Rampant Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Before we get started today, I have just a couple of general tips and troubleshooting items to go over. We are going to be having a live Q&A for anyone who's watching live tonight after the conversation. So please submit your questions at any time using our web form, which is linked in the event description just below this video. Our presenters will be selecting questions off of that form after the event, and we'll try to get through as many as we have time for today. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button right in YouTube. If you're having any issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you first try reloading the page. And then if you're still having issues, it can help to adjust your video settings right in YouTube. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Thenmozhi and Rhonda, and then we will get right to their conversation. Rhonda Magee is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. Also trained in sociology and mindfulness-based stress reduction, she is a highly practiced facilitator of trauma-sensitive, restorative MBSR interventions for lawyers and law students, and for minimizing the effects of social identity-based bias. Magee has been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society and a visiting professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, and theorist. She is a frequent contributor on issues related to South Asia, caste, gender, and racial equity, as well as interfaith issues and peace building. She's been featured on NBC, ABC, BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera, and in the New York Times, The Washington Post, Slate, and The Guardian. Currently, she is the co-founder and executive director of Equality Labs, one of the largest Dalit civil rights organizations working to empower caste-oppressed people in the United States and globally. Thenmozhi previously co-founded Third World Majority, an international media training organization and collective. Her work has been recognized by the U.S. Congress, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Producers Guild of America Diversity Program, the Sorbonne, Source Magazine, Utni Reader, the National Center for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. She was an inaugural fellow of the Robert Rauschenberg Artist as Activist Fellowship, the Unicorn Fund, the Atlantic Foundation for Racial Equity, and is a current fellow at the Stanford Center for South Asian Studies. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Thenmozhi and Rhonda.
Hi, Rhonda. Such a pleasure to be here with you. It feels like we've had centuries in the making to get here.
This is true. And of course, this is not our first time connecting and being in conversation. And yet it seems like it's been a while. So I'm just really excited to be here now. And I'm so excited to be talking with you about your book. Last time we were together, the book hadn't come out yet, right? Yay. So wow, it's your life story and the work that you've been doing is long, broad, and deep. And deep bows to you just at the front end for all that you have been doing, and in particular for this work, The Trauma of Caste. Subtitle is A Dalit Feminist Meditation on Survivorship, Healing, and Abolition. Wow. Well, we're here today to we're going to spend some time just really talking about this work. And I can't wait to unpack it with you. But before we do that, I'd love to offer a bit of a meditation. Um, One of the things that I've been doing, not only serving as a law professor and a mindfulness teacher, but the book that I wrote, I'll go ahead and lift it up. We're doing that. The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness is always a ground of support for me when we engage in conversations like this, which I see as part of the justice work we do in the world, right? Just one dimension of it. So I'd love it if you, my dear Thenmozhi, and all those who are here gathered would be willing to just pause for a moment of connecting to ground and source as a preliminary for this important conversation.
And I think it's just so important because I know everyone that's coming in here is coming from the hecticness of the day and whatever struggles we might have. And being able to create that collective container is so nurturing. So thank you, Rhonda, for holding that space for all of us. So I'm going to get ready to dig in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. And so all of us, wherever we happen to be, can just take a moment to dig in, feel the body in this moment, starting perhaps with points of contact between body and the support that exists for you right here, right now, be it a chair, you might be on a couch, a cushion, a bed, standing on the floor, inside or outside, or perhaps in motion as you're listening to this in transit. The invitation is to just allow the body in this moment to come home to a sense of being held and resting right here, right now, feet on the floor or ground or other support. And allow yourself to have a sense of relaxed belonging right here, right now. You have managed to find your way over to a place to allow yourself to listen to this conversation. And so the invitation is to allow yourself to just relax in an alert sense of being present and feeling the aliveness in the body as you breathe in and out. Perhaps on the next in-breath, sensing what is well within you, opening up the space to feel the goodness of your heart and being. And then just breathing out and relaxing and releasing, and just feeling the sense of gravity holding you, the sense of warmth that is your body and sustains you wherever you are right now, the light within. And just when and as you're ready, if the eyes have been closed for this brief moment of settling in, inviting them to open and to allow this sense of ingathering and grounding to be the sort of like hand of support that we rest in as we reflect on these important matters right here, right now. And anytime we might need a little bit of extra hand of support, these inner practices are a resource for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Thank
it's
you.
it's so important because I think our nervous systems are destabilized every day by systems of oppression, by illness and ancestral pain. So
Hmm.
being able to return back and then also to create collective containers for recentering, they're really the path towards those limitless feminist futures that we are really trying to build at this time. So I just love that you brought us right here,
Right
right
here,
now.
right
And
now.
we are present.
Yeah, and I love that you just named that this is, not it's for ourselves and for our strengthening. We have all been going through so much, right? The pandemics are not over. even though we're being told they're over, right? So wherever we are in this moment, those who are joining in this conversation with us as we are connecting here live, we've all been through a lot, and we all probably have our own particular healing to do. And so practices like these can help, and this kind of community grounded in practices. So I love that you named that this is, in a way, part and parcel of what feminist um, critical kind of perspective in the world supports. That we know that our own bodies matter, that we know that our own well-being matters, and that in and of itself is activist revolutionary work to recognize and honor our body and being. So, my dear, I just noted too that you coughed a little bit. I might cough a little bit. I know we've both been, again, physically bearing up with our own literal physical healing. So, just sending you much loving support as
I
we
need that.
open up the
Oof.
conversation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please take that in.
I I'm like taking a shower in
Yes,
Rhonda v.
yes,
Magee love, and also
yes.
I need that, and also
Sending it.
just
Yeah.
the treasure of the beloved community, because
Yes.
I think with all these systems of oppression, it is so easy to feel siloed and alone.
Mm,
And I think this is why we wrote the books that we wrote,
yeah.
is that we wanted to be able to have people see that there is a mirror of freedom when we
Mm,
enter in ourselves and then create grounded relationships with each other. When we've really seen who we are on the inside and then
mhm.
map without attachment to other beings.
Absolutely. So thank you for naming that practice dimension of it, the experiential dimension of it, and putting those beautiful words to it. And also, of course, we write these books because we got something to say about some things that we really care about. So really wanting to get into that right now, if we can just shift. So this book is a force, I think, like in and of itself. It's like a force of like whew, light and heat and wisdom. Um, it's very moving. I happen to have been one of those people who had a chance to look at it in draft and send a little bit of a blurb. But for all those who haven't read it, I want everybody to go out and get a copy. But be prepared for a real engagement with things that matter. It's not light reading, it's not gonna be easy to read, but there is a lot of love and hope in this entire story too. So my dear, can you share just a little bit about, um, you know, what made you write this book at this time?
Well, I think like everyone, you know, there was a certain point over the last 3 years where I felt that I was just kind of brought to my knees, and for those in the South Asian community, we went, from 2019 with the opening of a genocidal project in our homelands in India to the pandemic of 2020. And then, of course, we all saw the uprising and then a coup and all of them. That's just getting us through 2021. We're not even talking about 2022, right? And I think in talking with many of my elders and other activists, the thing that was so profound is people who had dedicated lifetimes to civil rights, to feminism, to survivor power, were watching all of their wins be eroded in front of them as society destabilized, and we were getting into more and more increased cycles of polarization. And for me, I have a very specific experience of it, not just from racial justice, but in terms of caste violence and caste discrimination. And I just felt like there had to be another way, and I had such a abiding grief about it, because when
Mhm,
you see how broken society is, when you face the fury of the bigoted and you watch, nothing is going to kind of turn them down. It's not about facts, it's not about the right spreadsheet. There's something at a very deep level on how their nervous systems were trained. And I
mhm,
searched and I searched for answers around that, and it wasn't on the outside, it was on the
mhm,
inside. And
mhm,
so I think, like the Buddha, in the face of all of this trauma, I just sat.
mhm,
And I just really gave myself some time to stop firefighting as an activist and going from one rapid response situation, which I'm sure all of us feel like we've been in for the last couple of years.
Mhm.
And I wanted to look up from the ground and go to the stars and think, how did we get here? And are there ways to de-escalate? And it was in that work that, and outside of me doing my inner work and thinking about my own nervous system, I found amazing Black somatic abolitionists and Buddhists like yourself and Ruth King
Mhm.
and Resma Menachem and indigenous
Mhm.
thinkers like Eduardo Duran and Maria Braveheart, who opened up a whole terrain of the body and the nervous system as a terrain to understand systems of oppression. And so
Mhm.
that piece was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, was to make those ties to this terrible experience of caste. And then I also had this very personal reason for writing, which was that my mom was diagnosed terminal.
Mm.
And
So
I,
sorry to hear.
yeah, I mean, we both have challenges that we're dealing with in this
Mhm.
way, but things just become super dialed in, super real when someone close to you is fighting for their life.
Mhm.
And in the backdrop of all of the death of COVID, I just could not help but look at all the structural reasons why my mom was in the way that she was, and
Mhm.
she has, her kidneys failed. And I'll always remember the first time I went into a dialysis center for the first time, it is all Black and brown elders,
Mhm.
and they're bus drivers, they're social workers, they're people who dedicated their lives to servicing society. And
Mhm.
now they've been just thrown away in these like dilapidated centers. And it just broke my heart. And when I saw that, that also really pushed me to go deeper. And so, out of that journeying, and also really thinking about what solution can I help bring to people to heal, because so many of these problems, we assume that they're going to be persistent, or people are trying to find tactical ways to take apart our opponents. And the reality is that when you're in the middle of a genocide, the only choice you have is de-escalation, but you can't de-escalate if your own body is in a constant state of survival. So for me, it was about trying to find a way to build a path towards light in a time
Wow.
of death.
Wow. I hope we'll circle back around to some of the specific ways that you accessed that light. Like this, you said you just sort of sat and kind of knew that you needed to restore. So hopefully we'll come back to a little bit of those, kind of stories from your own experience of, how you've regenerated, how you've sustained yourself, maybe some of the practices specifically that you do to sustain. But before we get into that, I'm just curious if you could say just a little bit more about, the the theme of the book about the trauma of caste. Ooh, there's so much there. Um, um, Folks on this call may be familiar with what caste is, but if you could share just a little bit about some of those concepts, caste, the trauma. In your book, I know you use the beautiful phrase soul wound. So I wonder if you could just help us, unpack a little bit of the concepts that and the lived experiences that help us understand what those terms mean in your work.
Oh, absolutely. So, for folks that have never heard of the word caste, it's a system of exclusion that has its origins in South Asia, but is now found all around the world. And it basically ranks people at birth, into these different classes of people. So the people at the top who kind of developed this system were the priests or the Brahmins, and they have the most power and the most structural control. And then you start to get different grades of other professions that go down in lowering purity. So underneath the Brahmin priests are the rulers, who are the Kshatriyas. And then you have the merchants, who are the Vaishyas. You have the Shudras, who are the peasants. And then outside of this caste pyramid are those that were outcasted and shunned, given the worst jobs and facing extreme physical violence, and even told that they were spiritually defiling to other people. And that's why they were called untouchables.
Mhm.
So that's my caste. And of course, nobody gets to, decide your place, in front of the divine. And so we reject that term and we call ourselves Dalit or
Mhm.
caste oppressed or, a religion that we've converted to out of it. And then there are also indigenous people who are caste oppressed that are outside of those systems. They call themselves Adivasi or tribal. But this is the social logic of anyone that comes from South Asia. So caste impacts 1.9 billion people in the world. That's one in
Mhm.
four people. And in the United States, around 5.7 million people. And
Mhm.
it's significantly found here. And there are so many dimensions to it. And, there are, many books that talk about the economic and political and underdevelopment issues that come with such a punishing system of exclusion. But there's very few that look at caste at the lens of trauma. And I was deeply interested in that because the way I understood caste, being someone who lived in the diaspora, is that it shouldn't be here.
Mhm.
There's no reason for it to be here, right?
And it's in fact technically illegal, isn't it? I mean, to discriminate based on caste,
It
right?
definitely in India, and
In
the
India.
understanding in the US is that it's considered to be under other protected categories, like race and descent and
Mhm.
faith and so on. But those protections aren't sufficient given how grave some of the things that we're seeing here. So,
Mhm. And
you
they're
know,
not sufficient given how deep these ideas are, especially in the in the countries and cultures of origin, right?
exactly.
The notion of caste goes back millennia, really a long, long
It
time,
goes
right?
back to 2000 BC, and even though it started in Hinduism, it's now found in every faith practice within South Asian communities. But
Mm.
I think the thing that I found so challenging about growing up here was that it shouldn't be here, and yet it defines every aspect of the
Mm.
diaspora. And
Say more about that because I think for a lot of people who are here, they don't know the
they
right.
don't
So
know.
can you just share a little bit more about what you mean when you say it shouldn't be here, but it is here, even in the United States?
Well, I think that for folks that, haven't really, examined the ways that we bring our baggage as immigrants,
Mm.
caste oppressed people are essentially a minority within a minority.
Mm.
We are racialized as South Asian, but actually all of this baggage from all of our, historical trauma has come with us.
Mhm.
So, whether it's trauma related to caste or genocide or
Mhm.
how, nations were built through violence and, sexual violence, it's all there. And we don't talk about it because we're the model minority. So it just kind of gets smashed and people keep going, but the
Mm.
trauma lingers. The trauma is all around us. And I had a
Mm.
personal experience with that, watching my parents live in the closet, be terrified about being outed. And so that began my inquiry about both understanding
Mm.
who I was as Dalit, but also having a language for the trauma I was seeing. And that's where the work of people like Eduardo Duran and Maria Braveheart and Resma Menachem were so impactful for me, because in their work, they talk about how, as they're working with Indigenous and Black clients, they saw that people had a grief that went beyond their bodies. It was
Mm.
just about their one lifetime. And that's what they call the soul wound.
Mm.
It's the wound you carry of yourself, but also of your lineage. So, in the case of Eduardo Duran and Maria Braveheart, they're talking about it in terms of settler colonialism and Indigenous genocide. And in the case of Resma Menachem and in your work and Ruth
Mhm.
King's, you are thinking about it in terms of white supremacy. And in fact, he talks about it as white body supremacy.
Mhm.
And that was an incredible aha moment for me to kind of read all of these works together and think about, how was my body trained around
Mm.
caste?
Mm.
What is the caste soul wound? And,
Mhm.
the process of writing a book that goes deep like this is, you basically are bringing all the parts of yourself, your consciousness, that have been scattered by violence.
Mhm.
And I will say that until I wrote this book, I was definitely an expert about caste and could talk about different data points, have, substantial experience supporting survivors, in the region and also here in
Mhm.
North America. But I think I hadn't claimed or understood the wound I had
Mm.
about being a survivor of religious abuse.
Wow.
and how much I had felt dispossessed from spaces of spirituality, and how absent I was from parts of my body because of the sheer terror and violence and bigotry that I've gone to. And everyone that's a civil rights activist who's been on this call can really relate to it. It's like, you know what you have to do? You got to go and get stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
Inside, your gut is churning. Maybe you're having your heartbeat really fast, or you go home late at night and you're an insomniac, or you have panic attacks. Like,
Mm-hmm.
our bodies are, it's not that our bodies aren't as courageous as our minds. It's that we're not having a container that's sufficient enough to really hold that structural violence that is represented by those soul wounds, because no one person is ever meant to hold that.
Mm.
So to write this book was really to go through the process of re-embodying myself.
Mm. Beautiful.
And that's hard work to do, you know. And you were asking me, like, what kind of processes did I do to restore myself?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like before restoration began, I had to acknowledge that I had grief
Mm.
and how afraid I was, and just, you know, how, I mean, I don't know how to explain what it feels like to be dispossessed.
But it sounds like really you're talking about just acknowledging, first of all, again, coming home to this body and really allowing yourself the space to notice, recognize, see, right? And then fully appreciate in the sense of acknowledging this is here. This body is suffering. There's fear here. There's, trauma embedded in the body and the resonances of this. So it was becoming aware of what you were carrying, even underneath all the work you were doing.
And not just that, but there is a very particular viciousness when your soul wound is related to spiritual dispossession,
Mm,
because there is a deep human right to be able to kind of be a seeker, you know.
mhm,
People go outside, you know, it's late at night, you look at the stars and you wonder, like, you know, who am I and where do I belong?
mhm,
And I think for caste oppressed people and other survivors of religious abuse,
mhm.
that right to seek has been robbed. We've been robbed from it.
Yeah.
And there were so many times where I am this tradition, I'm part of this community.
Mhm,
And I felt, you know, that it wasn't for me. And
mhm,
there is a lessening of yourself, because, you know, to really be integrated, it is really the mind, the body, and the spirit. And when you truncate the spirit like that, you become smaller and you become diminished. And so
mhm.
to acknowledge the wound was to let it become a portal.
Yeah.
So for
Wow.
me, I felt I could, you know, acknowledge I was a seeker. I could claim my divinity, and I could choose to be witchy and spirit driven on my own terms, without having to circumscribe myself to hegemonies that have been so damning and painful. And having that process was everything.
Mm,
I think that's so much of the healing that I wrote in this book,
mhm,
because so many people that are South Asian or are connected to dharmic lineages, or lineages that come from South Asia and these traditions rooted in caste and Brahmanism, you
mhm,
know, the ideology that formed caste.
mhm.
People are trained in a particular way to think that only the divine can be only accessed by a limited few. So to democratize that and to return consent even into my own body,
Mhm.
it was such a powerful opening.
Wow. Well, I'm just aware that what you're saying is on one hand a kind of a description of what it feels like to be sort of spiritually alienated if through in relationship to the religious culture in which you were born because of this sort of embedded oppressive hierarchy around caste that sought at least right in you know its efforts were to kind of relegate you to a certain place of disownment or not belonging And so, yes, you're feeling that alienation and you found your way into a healing relationship with spirit, right? Because the tradition you were born into was a wound created, right? This place of wounding. So I'm hearing that particular piece and that your particular journey in that. I'm also hearing the resonances with what in between what you're saying and what, African Americans have felt, who, especially Southern based ones, as I was born in the South in a community in which my grandmother had been called to religion. My grandmother was a preacher, but women and African Americans were, oppressed within Christianity. We're told that enslavement was a punishment for our being sons of Ham, right? There was a religious narrative that justified our enslavement. So I think many of us, again, we've got our unique stories, and your book is helping us understand the particular ways that caste oppression is showing up in the bodies of those who were deemed untouchable Dalit beings. And that particular story is so important, and we're learning so much about it. But I hope everyone's also hearing that your story helps maybe us all understand that these dynamics happen in different ways through different cultures, and we have something in common. And it's important to see the differences and to learn from each other. And I think also if we can become more empathic about how we as human beings suffer similarly through hearing your story and similar stories, then that's really a pathway to deepening our human rights and our civil rights work and our movement work together. Wow. So this healing dimension then is unique, I think, to your study around castes. As you mentioned, you had been doing a lot of caste oppressive, anti-caste work. And this book is the first really effort to bring the spirit of healing really strongly to the fore. And so, you know, I'd love it if you could share just a little bit more about some of the ways, if you were willing to talk about specific healing practices that you engage in. That'd be one thing I'm sure and the listeners would be curious about. But also ways that you see this sort of anti-caste work and maybe the impetus to do that comes out of your own, Dalit Buddhist commitments, how you see that showing up and enlivening social protests, social movements. In other words, how your own practices, if you could say a little bit about that, but also maybe a little bit about how this orientation is helping inspire and uplift people who are doing the anti-oppressive work right now.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer that in two different parts, I think.
Okay.
So I think that, one thing, in going back to that idea of the soul wound, the thing that I thought was so profound, it really helped me think of new tactical approaches to some of the problems that we're seeing in movement building, was that, any system of exclusion, there's always an over focus on the consequences of that system in terms of the bodies of the oppressed. But we don't have enough focus on, what exactly is happening in the bodies and the nervous system of the privileged. And soul wounds really tie us both into that kind of terrible mess. And so I think that when you think about healing within that context, you really have to have different pathways and processes for those who have been struggling with systems of caste and race, and those who have been complicit and are the harm doers of it. And so I really tried to go back into my own experience with civil rights. And, your work was very, pivotal to me, because I would sit and think, I was like, Rhonda's a civil rights leader. She's a lawyer. She does strategic litigation. She does legal theory. Why does she go to mindfulness? And you have to read her book to find out. But I can say in my own practical experiences, I could see it being such a necessary part of our movement toolbox, because, especially when we're living in a time right now where there's a reversal of so many rights, and you're having parents in Tennessee who are trying to pass laws to ban the teaching of slavery because they don't, using the term trauma, they don't want their children to be traumatized by learning about slavery. You see that there is so much of the flow of civil rights that stopped by the fragility of the privileged. And that is not going to be solved simply by handing people a book or giving people facts, because if facts were going to change the mind of the bigoted, we'd already be done with it. Because how many great scholars are there about both caste and race, right? But the
Exactly.
problem I see is that, you know, dominant classes of people, whether it's in race or in class, they just do not have enough training and self-awareness about how their bodies are reacting to caste and racial stress. And so as a result, just a small amount of exposure sends their wheels spinning, you know. And I will always remember, I was, you know, part of this community process to try to get caste as a protected category in Santa Clara. And there was this woman that was so unhinged in her testimony. And she would say things like, "Are you ready, Santa Clara Board of Supervisors, to have the blood of Hindus on your hand? Do you want Santa Clara to be ground zero for genocide? Do you want me to wear my caste on my arm like the Star of David? Because that's what you're going to do." And, you know, she was yelling at the top of her lungs. And, you know, the thing that I thought was so interesting is that the only thing that was being proposed was that caste would be added to a list of protected categories for non-discrimination clauses. That doesn't do anything. But the fact that she viewed it with such terror and such vehemence and such rage, that really made me understand that we have to go under that hood, and that also the people that to de-escalate the privileged aren't the oppressed. It has to be their own kin. It has to be families and friends that have said, I am going to put down and really address my part, you know, my part in this caste soul wound, and really, you know, start to do my work of unlearning caste supremacy, and talk to my aunties, talk to my uncles, and figure it out, you know. And so that really began a process in our work in equality labs, where alongside of our advocacy, we've built a whole somatics, mindfulness centered racial and caste equity training program called Unlearning Caste Supremacy, which really helps give people the history, but also the training in terms of somatic abolitionist practices that are rooted in Dalit feminism, to help people understand how they can de-escalate together.
Mhm.
And that's changed everything, because in terms of my healing process, I think one of the hardest things when you're fighting a system of oppression is when you feel alone in it,
Mhm.
and also that your inner experience has no empathetic witness. And
Mm.
so I think there's a huge part of when people enter communities of practice together, where they are speaking to the pain and also getting, you know, appropriate containers for release, but then also returned into beloved community. It's a very transformative process, because we're not like burning our bodies just to get the political win. We're also looking at what are ways that we can really meaningfully transform our outer world, because our inner worlds are grounded. And
Mhm.
and looking our ancestral and pain right directly in the eyes for release.
Mhm.
So for me, you know, that work and seeing it on such a mass scale, because thousands of people have now taken our Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop, uh, it's taught me the importance of inner work. And it's taught me to really be confident enough to say, I need to take that hour and go do meditation. I need to listen to these binaural beats, which is another thing I find healing.
Mhm.
This is that time I'm going to go for that hike and spend time in nature and feel expansive. You know, there's so many ways that our bodies know how to, you know, regulate our nervous systems, you know, in silence with other people and with other species and the planet. But we have to draw on all of those allies, whether it's plant allies or, you know,
Mhm.
an ecosystem where you're forest bathing. And those things fall away when you're deeply under stress and
Mhm.
under the gun from systems of oppression. So it's almost like the other thing I do to really kind of keep me healthy and grounded is try to have effective boundaries. And Say that to any woman of color and you're going to be like, oh yeah, okay, we're trying.
We're working on it. Cough, cough. Overscheduled, right?
Yes, and also the fact that we're oftentimes the people doing the majority of caregiving in our communities, and in a time of a pandemic, we're the ones holding society together in these very unseen ways. But I still think even within that, there are small things you can do to restore, even if it's just 5 minutes. That commitment to your inner resource allows you to be a greater, resource to the world.
Indeed. Yeah. So I hear you just talking about ways that you sustain yourself, these various different commitments you've made to, you know, um, touching in, tapping into, and uh, restoring your inner resources. But also, I'm hearing you describe this really fine offering you've made, unlearning caste supremacy,
That's
right?
right.
That workshop. And which, I'm sure we can all find a little bit more about that if we Google and look for these things online, because I'm sure listeners would be curious to hear more. But the way you're describing personal inner work, interpersonal work, perhaps with other, caste oppressed people in affinity groups is what we often call it in this work of BIPOC or people of color, or healing amongst those of us who have experienced depression, getting in groups of folks who look like us, who have similar experiences so we can share. But I'm also hearing you describe, again, ways that those who identify with or have been among groups who have been identified as amongst the oppressors, those who are privileged in various ways, whether by race or by caste, come together and learn practices for regulating their nervous systems and for sitting in spaces of discomfort long enough to learn how to actually do some things differently and to teach others to do the same. So that is inspiring. And it's a lot of work. You and I mentioned just briefly on a call before this as a preparation, I mentioned to you in the work that I do with lawyers and activists these days. So I find myself working with people who are already inspired to try and change the world, who already see the importance of it, just as you were for much of your career, but who haven't necessarily come to understand the importance of doing their own work. So it's a struggle for them to actually devote time. And so if you have any tips or any advice to those who kind of hear this, they are in the midst of it, they know that while we are already feeling compassion, we already know that there's work to be done, it's hard for us to take time for ourselves. Is there anything that you can offer as a bit of advice for people who might just need to remember Thenmozhi said I should take some time for myself, and here's why? I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that directly.
Well, I think that, I think that I feel like one of the things that I keep seeing as a pattern is that even though everything looks okay, in society, inside everything is really kind of held together with bubble gum and toothpicks. We talked about this beforehand, right? And
Yes.
we're not all the same the way that we were before the pandemic. We're very, very frazzled. We have lost so much.
Mhm.
And it's not like society said, oh, pause, everyone's going to have 6 months to grieve. We had to work through tremendous family ending types of grief and pain, some who are still going through it. And
Mhm.
I think that when you fight for civil rights, or if you're in a justice battle right now, the tactics of your opponents are just so brutal. And we're in this like major campaign to get caste as a protected category in Seattle City right now, and
Mm.
we have seen absurd things where activists are dealing with rape threats and death threats, people making insinuations that people are terrorists, or anti-Hindu, or you name it, everything under the sun, whatever
Mm.
they can stick to try to demoralize you, to try to
Mhm.
deplatform you. And so what I found is actually that people are willing to stand up. People are willing to be people of courage, but they don't know often how to restore in the face of that pernicious violence.
Right.
So I actually find the opposite is that in the work that I'm doing, people are actually gravitating to the work that we're doing in equality labs, and it's really a Dalit feminist model or a woman of color feminist model where
Hmm.
we're not going to have people, run up against violence and not do something to restore. Because this is the other thing that I think that's so critical about mindfulness practices, especially as articulated by BIPOC thinkers, is that this is not about going into a mountain and having your own retreat. This is
Hmm.
about really learning about the fact that suffering exists, and for
Hmm.
us, this means, structural violence. And we often cannot remove ourselves from that signal of violence. So we have to really learn how to attenuate it so that we can
Hmm.
process it and still be able to be whole as can be, but whole,
Hmm.
so that we can proceed. And that attenuation process is something you can only do through lived practice. You can't just read about it and be like, okay, it's
Yeah.
a one
Yeah.
and done. You have
Exactly.
to you have to really metabolize. You,
And it takes time.
it takes time. It takes
Right. And
time.
sometimes we need a break. We need to pull back and rest, right? From the go, go, go impetus of the particular project that we're involved in, giving ourselves that time to restore. Burnout is a big problem for many of us. Speaking of the many different, slings and arrows we have taken within the things we're holding together with chewing gum and so on right now, people are really overwhelmed and exhausted. So knowing the signals in our bodies that suggest we actually do need to rest if we're going to sustain in this struggle for the long haul. We
Mhm.
do need to go to a quality labs, meditation session or whatever is being offered to help restore. Really, I hope folks who are in the struggles, because we need you all, we need everybody, and we need all of us to be able to sustain. I hope you're hearing this part of it because I do think it's really, really important. And so at the same time, the teachings that are available now through Equality Labs, and as you read this book, for those who are invited to do the change, to do the reckoning, right? That has been ongoing, and people of good conscience who are privileged, white-bodied, upper caste people, people of all different walks of life who are invited into the social justice challenges of our time these days. Um, Many of them do need extra support too, and need support
Absolutely.
as you're describing it, right? For all of the challenges that come to the body when you realize uh, many ways you've been miseducated, despite what a fancy education you got somewhere, right? Where you didn't learn all of these things that you should have learned, or all the things about, some aspects of your own personal history or community history that have been buried, that have not been brought to the surface that you now have to confront. Doing that is not easy. So thank you so much for naming and then exploring in different ways in this book and in your work with the Quality Labs, how all of us can discern what our curriculum is. Like, what is the healing we each need to do? It's going to look different for me than it is for, my white male colleague somewhere. It's going to look different for you than it will perhaps for an Indigenous American. But we all have some healing to do, and we can lean into a kind of a set of practices that helps us with this healing that you're just beautifully introducing into the work in the trauma of caste. So you've already been alluding in your conversation so far, my dear, to some of the good news or the things that give you hope. You're talking about some of the wonderful projects you're engaged in, bringing caste into the law and policy of anti-discrimination in Santa Clara, in Seattle, different places where you're actually making progress. There is good news out there. By the way, in my work, I'm seeing changes being made in California to how we train police and, requirements for police in terms of anti-racist education, new programs being offered so you can become a social justice trained police officer, right? So things are happening. It may not be changes overnight. We know there's a lot of pain still out there, but I'm curious if you could give the listeners a bit of a view out the window that you can see when you are seeing things that give you hope. What are the things? What are the kinds of experiences? You know, for me, I like to say that the work that we do is part of justice, including this conversation. And being in contact with other people who are doing the work is justice and feels like justice in my heart, right? It feels like it's love in public, as Cornel West, right, would say. So, but I'm curious, when you feel and see some of that love in public, what are some of the things that you're seeing that give you hope in these times?
Well, I think that, again, I feel like when you really deeply understand your roots, you are able to reach for the stars. And, part of why I also did this deep dive is that, again, for people of South Asian descent, and especially those that are Indian American, our diaspora is being ripped apart by this genocidal project back at home. And it's been a terrifying thing to watch social norms and communities being just targeted in this like endless, absurd way, ultimately leading to a project that's going to put millions of people in concentration camps. And I think there is no greater eclipse of life than to see such an enormous, terrifying project for death.
Mm,
And part of what I had to do to generate hope around it, because that's a pretty hopeless situation,
mhm,
was, after in my book, I go through like the social history of caste. I talk about caste in the United States. I talk about its religious origins, which my seeker self really loved.
mhm,
And then after talking about it in many institutions, I really go to thinking about this genocidal project and what
yeah,
does it take to turn away from death. And I read all of the testimonies from the genocides that have occurred in South Asia. This was a very difficult thing to do, but while most people think of South Asia as the place of like eat, pray, love, and enlightenment, in
mhm,
fact, we have terrifying genocides. Whether it's the Sikh genocide, the Sri Lankan genocide, the violence that happened at the partitioning that led to India and Pakistan, and then later
mhm,
the Bangladeshi Independence War, where that was the world's largest mass rape of over 300,000, bodies, and of course caste, which is the blueprint
mhm.
for all this
And
violence.
when you point to the 2019 project, which are you specifically, just so the
Oh,
listeners know
oh, for
exactly?
sure. So in 2019, the government of India under Narendra Modi basically passed a law that created religious specifications for citizenship, with the intention of saying that anyone that didn't fit this model would be put into detention camps. And they already have 14 of them. There's already million, like close to like 2 million people in jail. And the project was intended to grow, and it was stopped in part by the pandemic. But there's other ways that, and this really targets Indian Muslims primarily, and then caste oppressed people and poor and trans and non-binary folks.
Mm,
And it's a terrifying thing to watch, especially our homelands that are, were really known to be secular, to watch it turn into this like very
mhm,
terrible religious ethno-nationalism.
right.
But I bring this up in terms of the context of hope, because
Mm,
when I would read those testimonies of genocide,
mhm,
no matter how dark it got, each of those stories always had someone who chose to be a light in the darkness. They might have been a friend, they might have been a neighbor, maybe it was someone who was the delivery person. They were the ones that basically helped people escape, or hid them underneath the basement, or rolled them in a rug and then pushed them out on the cart. Whatever the
mhm,
story was, there was someone that chose to break away from the death cult to
mm,
choose life.
mhm,
And I think that is the tremendous place where I find so much hope, because
mm,
it's one thing to read about genocide, it's another thing to watch the dynamics of genocide within your community. And I see so many people of courage who are speaking up. They know that they might get targeted, and their families at home might be facing arrests or being raided, but everyone is finding big ways and small ways to resist. And
mhm,
that's the loving, beloved community that I really generate so much hope for, because I
mm,
think that there are more of us that want to choose life than those that want to profit from death.
yeah. And there always have been, and I believe there
Right,
always will be. I mean, we are
right.
standing on the shoulders of generations of those who have chosen life, right? This is how we got here. So Thank you so much for sharing that. And I guess as we prepare to bring our conversation to the close and open up to Q&A, um, you've been pointing to this sort of beloved community of those who are choosing life and in these, you know, horrifying times in a certain sense, right? On a certain, I mean, let's be real. To talk about contemporary genocide and the ongoing absolute horrors of caste oppression, um, and it doesn't take. It's not that hard to find. Folks are not sure what specific types of horrors we're talking about, and you haven't had a chance to read this beautiful book, which I hope you're ordering right now if you don't have it already. Um, while you're waiting for your book to arrive, if you're not getting the Kindle, just do a search, right? You can see caste-based violence, and you will see. Um, and yet we are here, and yet we are finding places where we can feel safe, and we're creating beloved community. So I'm wondering if you could just uplift the names of a few Dalit diaspora uh, heroes, sheroes, people who inspire you, because I do believe in amplifying the names of those whose work is going underseen and underappreciated in these times. Who comes up for you? Who people who are inspiring you right now when you think about the work being done?
So for me, I think what caste oppressed people want is for people to be in beloved community with us, lift up our
Hmm.
ancestors, lift up
Yeah.
our stories, join our movements because we want to be part of your movements because we
Yeah.
see this as shared liberation.
Hmm.
And two people that really come to my mind. One is Dr. Ambedkar, who was this like towering figure in
Yes.
Dalit liberation. He was
Hmm.
the architect of the Indian Constitution. He was everything. He was a statesman, a lawyer, he was a civil rights activist, and he was also a socially engaged Buddhist. And
Hmm.
every domain he went into was an intervention for freedom. And I think what I just have really appreciated about him so much was not just the precision of his mind, and
Hmm.
and
Tremendous.
yes, and that unrelenting commitment to freedom, but also his that unrelenting pursuit of justice was also there for him as a seeker, because he was also trying to find a place. What is the appropriate spiritual and political home for people who've been dispossessed by many traditions?
And it all led him to Buddhism, right?
Yes,
And to
yes.
really converting,
And
right?
led one of the largest conversions in world history of people
Mass
from
conversion
Hinduism
of
to Buddhism. It
mm,
was like
mm,
close to 400,000 people. So,
amazing.
he is one of the first Dalit Americans, and he went to school in Columbia.
Yep.
And we worked with Representative Ro Khanna's office to celebrate his birthday on April 14th and to have Congress recognize Dalit History Month.
Oh
So to
yeah.
me, I always carry him everywhere with me.
Baba Ambedkar, yeah.
Yes, yes,
Mm,
yes. And then another set of ancestors I want to bring up are the Phules, Jyotibai Phule and Savitribai Phule. And
mm,
they were a really amazing caste oppressed couple. They wrote beautiful, beautiful poetry and books, and were just fierce anti-colonialists and also called out Brahmanism. And
mhm.
what they're known for is the fact that they created some of the first women's schools,
Wow.
and because girls were not allowed to be go to school under Brahminical tradition. And when they would go to school every day, dominant caste people would throw shit and urine at them, and they had to carry a change of clothes in order to be able to go and finally teach women and
Mhm, mhm,
widows and young girls. And that commitment of what it was to educate in the face of violence, to stay focused on life, I love their spirits, and their spirits like really energize me every day. So
yeah.
those three ancestors are there, and there's
Mhm.
actually a lot of different ancestor profiles in
In
my
the book.
book.
In the
Yes,
book.
in the book, it's
In
like it
in
has
one
it
of the
all.
appendix. In the appendix, right?
Yes, because that's,
Absolutely.
there's so many things when people want to unlearn caste, they're like, okay, well, what's the history? What's the data? What do I do? And then it gets personal. It's like, well, what is it for me? So there's also worksheets, there's meditation,
Mhm.
and and a glossary so that people don't feel intimidated about kind of
Mm-hmm.
entering this world because the vocabulary is unfamiliar. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but I also think that this book is never meant to be read alone. I think you need to read it in beloved community and
Yes.
think about these ideas, because it really does shift your perspective. If you come from a dharmic tradition, you will probably be like, oh, it's like a matrix moment where you're like, whoa, everything is different than what I understood. Things like dharma, things like karma, things like reincarnation, and really thinking about duty and purity and pollution. These are all kind of like hallmarks you may have been exposed to if you're part of tradition that comes out of a dharmic lineage, and you have to examine them differently when you understand how much pain is at the root of some of those processes. So
Mm-hmm.
there is tremendous opening, but you really want to take your time to do that work and see where it sits in your body and in your own understanding.
Right. And to do it in beloved community. I love that as a suggestion because, again, these are not historical only in terms of the pain and suffering that your book is helping us see. The things that you're describing are happening right now, as well. So thank you so much. I want to open this up to our audience to see what kinds of questions um, might be, um, let's see, being presented. Let's see, I see a question here. My glasses so I can read a little better from Lena. If I may go ahead and read this, as a diasporan caste privileged human working to deepen my understanding of this privilege that for many years I thought I hadn't benefited from, I've begun to deepen my awareness and also to organize a book club with fellow South Asian bodies so that we can start to build culture, in the words of Resma Menachem, to begin to interrogate our complicity and consider the ways we perpetuate the system of oppression. What advice would you have for anyone who is working to call in fellow community members with the hope of creating the cultural resilience needed to disrupt the system?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think Lena is actually joining thousands of people in movements all around the world who are really committed to that work of unlearning privilege. And I think it's a lifetime journey. And, I think sometimes when you first begin that journey, your instinct is to go outward. It's like, I need to call it out everywhere that I see it. And that is a really wonderful and noble intention. But actually, that's part of the reasons why so many of the thinkers that I mentioned, and, I would also, recommend you want to really start with yourself, start with your lineage, start with the people that are close to you, and be observational before interrogative, because the reality is that it's kind of like rattling a bee's nest. If you haven't done that work of thoughtfulness, of understanding where it shows up for you, you won't be able to de-escalate people when you start engaging with them to talk about what is those painful things, especially if it's people in your families who have been part of caste violence. And I always remember talking to someone who had this like terrible reckoning, because they always told that story about, oh, my family came with only like $5 in my pocket and look, we've made it. And after they had been in relationship with caste suppressed people, they went back and they saw that actually their family were like plantation owners, and that their family members back at home were inappropriately abusing and exploiting the workers of the land. And it was really hard to hold, especially because there was a history of, child sexual abuse and domestic violence in her family. So it's like the external violence that their family inflicted on the land and the caste oppressed people was also imploding their family. And so it really took some time for her to reckon with and put all of these pieces together, because violence really breaks apart all your meaning, so you can't put those dots together to find the structural root and deal with it. So I would say go slow.
Go
Start with your
slow.
own body, work with
Mm,
your own lineage, and ask questions. And if you find that you want to make collective interventions, really think about ways that you can center empathy and transformative justice. Because the thing is that de-escalation requires you to have some sort of connection with the person you're de-escalating. And it's really hard, especially when they are super bigoted and super violent. And, and that's not to say that, we actually have a whole inequality labs that we made for how people can have courageous conversations during holidays related to caste. So I know, and it actually starts with having a safety plan, because we're not asking people to make these interventions without a risk assessment around, are the people that you're doing this with safe to do it with?
Mm,
But that said, de-escalation happens through trust, especially because many bigoted people are in filter bubbles that are trauma, that are kind of like holding them hostage to their trauma, and that are filled with disinformation and lies. So to restore consensus, you got to go in there and you got to talk to them. It's almost like deprogramming people out of a cult, right?
mhm,
But you can't do that work if you view it as oppositional. You've got to be super strategic and figure out ways to do that. And, I want my allies to do that, because if
mhm,
I do it as a Dalit person, I risk death, I risk violence, I risk assault, but they're not going to do that to someone that is their kin. And so there's a closer connection there that can achieve that opening. And that's where I think, principles of non-attachment, being able to attenuate our signals of violence, are going to give us more sophisticated tools to
mhm.
end these cycles of polarization and get to a place of de-escalation and breaking those cycles
Yeah.
of endless violence.
So I'm pausing here before I go to the next question, just on one piece of what you shared and what's coming up for me. The idea that you say you wouldn't recommend people do this without a safety plan. That's real and deep, right? It's acknowledging that we're talking about real vulnerability that people face. And you also mentioned that while we have allies who we think are safer, right? Some of us, literally, our lives would be at risk. I also think that what we're seeing now is a level of dysregulation that suggests nobody's as safe as we used to think. People are coming after their family members. So I think all of us, right, have to really, really, build out our systems of support and find out ways to support ourselves and to discern when it's safe and when it's not, and through a process that we can develop in these workshops like the ones that you offer. So I really appreciate it. All right, let me open up. Let me see what else we have in the Q&A box. Okay, here's a question. Can you please give examples of how caste oppression is perpetrated in the U.S.? I was going to say perpetrated or perpetuated. That's what it says, actually. Perpetuated in the U.S. and in Western cultures. How can we as BIPOC avoid perpetuating caste?
I love this question, and it's so
Mhm,
practical. And so I'm going to be tactical here. So, the way caste shows up is similar to other systems of exclusion. And so, in our work in Equality Labs, we conducted the first survey that, established that caste existed here. And we saw terrifying things like 1 in 4 caste oppressed people experienced physical and verbal assault. 1 out of 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. And that data is backed up with story after story of exclusion, whether it's in family networks or people practicing untouchability. Like I had someone switch their plates because they didn't want me to pollute their cookingware and their dishware. There's open usage of slurs, you know bullying and harassment. Once they find out that you're Dalit, they just make fun of you. They expect you to be less than, because we are beneficiaries of affirmative action at home, so they assume that we're without skill and we're not there with merit. We're there because we took advantage of a policy, which I'm sure sounds very familiar, Rhonda,
mhm,
especially as we're
mhm,
waiting for this like affirmative action decision coming from the Supreme
mhm,
Court. But there's also sexual harassment and sexual assault, and in other workplaces, termination and demotion. So it's all the things that you hear when it comes about how caste operates here. They're all things that we know are civil rights problems and that are unlawful. And that's why we're in this moment with this caste equity movement, where even though caste is understood to exist underneath existing categories, it's not sufficient. There isn't enough training. And oftentimes, if it's not listed, a lot of HR people or people responsible for cultures of belonging, they turn away caste oppressed people looking for remedy. That's
mhm,
exactly what happened, in fact, in the California lawsuit, where the state of California is suing the Cisco Corporation for caste discrimination inside a Cisco Corporation. And there's another big case in New Jersey where, you know, a network across the country that were called BAPS. It's like a Hindu sect. They trafficked Dalit workers for working $1 an hour, called them worms, didn't let them use the bathroom, and seized their passports and made them live in, like, you know, untenable housing environments,
Mm,
just to make their religious temple. So
mm.
it looks like trafficking, it looks like worker exploitation, it looks like discriminatory syllabuses, it looks like discrimination in housing. It's all of these things. And so
Can it just be social disregard in communities and neighborhoods? When
yeah,
someone moves
definitely.
into the community or a family moves in and being
And the
treated
minute
with
that
disregard?
Yes, and the minute that they find out that you're Dalit, you're no longer invited and you're excluded and shunned. And in some parts of the country, you know, if you have like neighborhoods that are very South Asian, the parents groups are divided by caste. So there'll be like the Brahmin parents, the Kshatriya parents, the Vaishya parents. So it's an illness, you know, it's like a sickness, it's a trauma. When we repeat, you know, patterns of historical violence, that is acting out structural and systemic trauma. That's why we need to heal this, you know. But I think the way that we do it is we have to do it both through policy and cultural change. So
Mhm.
the first thing is that if you are part of an organization, ask them to add caste as a protected category. It's a pretty easy ask, and and then reach out to Quality Labs and let us know. We'll do a joint post about it. And you know, there's another institution that is, you know, now become welcome for all. And usually once that change happens, there's usually follow-up steps in terms of trainings that are related to caste equity DEI work to help people build their caste awareness related to how discrimination works inside the company or your grassroots organization. And then also celebrating Dalit joy and connecting with Dalit communities through, you know, months like Dalit History Month, which is April, and bringing Dalit speakers and just including caste in your conversation with all of the other domains of social justice you're looking at. And one thing I can definitely recommend, especially if you're part of a community that's holding some sort of dharma practice, is that when you do your land acknowledgement and when you do a racial justice acknowledgement, please include a caste equity acknowledgement. And it could be something as very simple as, we are practitioners of this dharmic lineage, we appreciate and get so much benefit from this practice, and we also honor and really hold the many millions of bodies of caste oppressed people that have been harmed in this tradition. And we witness that and we stand in solidarity with their pursuits for justice and freedom today. Something as simple as that, you know, allows there for there to be opening. Because again, when I go back to really kind of this book being a process of me owning my experiences being a survivor of religious abuse, part of the problem was is that every time I would go to a religious community, especially one that was exclusive on the basis of caste, and I'd bring up my issues, they would say, it's, I don't know what to do. You know, it's like, we can't question the masters, we can't question the text, when we can. We absolutely
Right.
can. You know, there's tons of things we don't do in like yoga practice. Like, we don't like put iron rods in our butts, and we're not eating cloth to like clean ourselves, right? We've adapted because the practice and the communities, you know, adapt, you know, even that traditional who could be a teacher, you know, we want bodies and all kinds of, you know, cultural and race backgrounds practicing. So we can accommodate caste equity in these dharmic practices, whether it's in Buddhist sanghas or
Mhm.
people who are doing yoga practice. You know, a key part of this work is that if we're going to talk about decolonizing and racial justice, we also have to talk about de-Brahmanizing and
Mhm.
examining the way that this animating ideology behind caste,
Mhm.
Brahmanism, has really created systems of inequity in the traditions that we have
Mhm.
found opening, but are still quite exclusive to many.
Wow, I love that you're naming this as a practice, a caste equity acknowledgement. You know, I think it just opens the mind to to the, you know, the call to include this particular practice, change things to include a practice like this, but and to think about other groups who have been oppressed within our religious and spiritual practice spaces, and how we might make more manifest our commitment to acknowledgement and to repair. Let me see what else. I want to bring another question in. Thank you so very much. This is really, really helpful. All right, here's another question from the audience. Given the different political, religious, and economic landscapes, does the work of dismantling caste systems look the same in the US and in India?
Absolutely. And I do want to make a correction. Caste isn't just in India, it's across South Asia. So we
Right.
have an entire region where caste has different historical manifestations, has different levels of economic deprivation. And so we require different tools for measure. But I would say what it looks like in South Asia is different in the United States, for sure. In South Asia, it's really about a process of reparation and investment after centuries of underdevelopment. And there has to be an accountability to an acknowledgement of harm. You know, the Indian government still does not want to recognize how significantly caste oppressed people have been harmed by this violence. So, you know, I feel like we can't begin that process of repair unless we acknowledge this has happened, right?
Hmm.
So there
And
are
this is happening.
it has
Sure.
happened, it is happening, and it requires investment, you know,
Mm,
so that we can allow people to really be at the same level playing field after centuries of exploitation and deprivation.
mm,
But I think in the United States, you know, we have a far more simpler path because caste isn't as firmly rooted here as obviously it would be in South Asia. Dominant caste people aren't in control. But it's recreating itself in very key industries where South Asians are really heavily represented. So, you know, in tech, it's a very serious problem because you have dominant caste people who are in those positions because of affirmative action. So they're getting these positions because, you know, they want to have more diverse companies, but they're pulling the ladder behind them. And then they're creating, you know, companies that are creating biased, you know, tech because biased companies create biased tech. So I think we have a lot of work to do to really build a baseline of caste equity across all institutions. And in order for us to heal from caste, we have to ban it. We have to not let it be okay. And and that's a big part of why so many caste oppressed people in the United States are coming out and speaking out. Because one, we're not going to face the severe violence that we face in India or any of the other South Asian countries. But here we also have, uh, you know, a rule of law for the most part. It does
I
not
know.
always get implemented in the ways
Right.
that we need to,
We
but
we
because,
we have a rule of law that we're working at the same time to shore up as we do the
yes,
work for justice
exactly.
here. We're trying to keep that rule of law strong.
No, but there's so many things that we benefit from because of the struggle of civil rights, because
Mm,
there, you know, because of the struggles of, you know, what we've seen in terms of Black folks really fighting for the right to be humanized in the face of, you know, white supremacist law. Those have really provided the platform for dignity for so many protected classes of people.
right. Well,
And
the
I think
14th Amendment and the entire equality discourse, as many of us now know, having on this side of the 1619 project and other projects to help us understand. But yes, equality law doctrine in the United States emerged out of the struggle for the rights of formerly enslaved people in the era of the post-Civil War. And so much of what we see as anti-discrimination law and discourse and practices and policies owe their vitality and their moral force to the efforts that have been made, obviously by African Americans. But I really appreciate the way you're helping us, and we will continue to think about it because we don't have even time to even begin, right? To continue interweaving and connecting these discourses and struggles. Because I think for me, one of the things that draws me to this work is that there is a broad movement toward human rights, toward equity for all of us, a world that can work for all of us, not to use the buzzwords of thriving or flourishing or whatever. How do we work and together to create change that we can all feel in our lives? This is what we're about. And I think your book is helping us move that even more courageously and radically forward to engage all of us in this consciousness raising about caste and the work of making more just workplaces and communities for all of us. including those from the South Asian diaspora. Okay, let me see if we can get one or two more questions in here. How do you view the resistance you encounter from people who refuse to acknowledge caste as systemic oppression? And there's actually someone who might want to ask this question live. I think, am I reading this right, Alex? Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Let me go ahead back over to you, Thenmozhi. How do you view resistance you encounter from people who refuse to acknowledge caste as systemic oppression?
I feel like I've had different experiences and feelings about it my whole life. I think, of course, as an oppressed person, when you first face gaslighting and those attacks, like, it's so heartbreaking. And it almost feels like you're Sisyphus, because you're trying so hard to move that mountain to be humanized. And then you have these people that just are so relentless in terms of dehumanizing you. And there's grief that comes with that. There's anger, there's disgust, and you just like hate every part of it. And then I think after year 2, year 10, year 15, you realize you cannot be in a constant state of antagonism. You cannot. It's just not healthy for your nervous system, but also you're not getting to the root causes of why they're behaving like this. So I can be smart and savvy and think about ways to outmaneuver them. But when I think in my deep meditative space, I just feel like I have tremendous, empathy for how lost these people are. Because, when you other another, you lose your humanity. And you certainly see that when you watch people. Like, I really encourage people. I know we were talking about this beforehand. Go watch those school board meetings where people are arguing to stop the teaching of race. Go and watch these like testimonies where people are saying that they don't want to add caste as a protected category. And you don't have to listen to the words. You just have to look at their faces. You have to look at their bodies. You have to look at what they're trapped in, that they're unable. They're so stuck in their ego and their attachments that they cannot see how enslaved they are to their own traumatized lineages of harm doing. And that's a tremendous place to see suffering, and and I can have empathy for my perpetrator and still have clear boundaries of what I need to do to protect myself and to move the flow of civil rights progress forward, which is, what I intend to do. And all of my people want to keep pursuing our right to be free. But I don't want to be stuck in an anger place with them because it ties me to their wound, when I want to be free and healed of my wound. And that's why I speak really consistently about the need to heal from caste. I want them to be free of this violence as well. I want them to be able to integrate back into a society, because that group of people is getting smaller and smaller. And the smaller they get, the angrier that they get, because they're cut off, and again, our nervous systems are not meant to regulate in isolation. They're meant to regulate, with each other, with other species and the earth. And so this moral compass of being able to ask people to think bigger than their pain and to be open just a little bit. I'm not saying we're all going to agree right at the beginning, but why not just try a little non-attachment? That could open the window of your filter bubble, which has trapped you into a whole wall of disinformation. And I'm thinking of it very deeply from my experience as someone who's Dalit, but all of us now know what it's like to have people that are held captive by falsehoods, whether it's QAnon or what we're seeing with Trumpers and the whole state of Florida and the GOP apparatus there, right?
Well, big lies, we've seen in our own lifetimes how big lies can be promulgated, received, imbibed, and held. And it's a teaching to realize that we're not the first generation to be fed a bunch of big lies. No. In fact, that is, again, part of how we got here. We're talking about long generations, millennia of big lies. And now we see how that works. And we also see how hard it is to disrupt. But I love that you're speaking to how we can have the moral imagination and the sense of beloved community and the practices, I'll speak for myself, that help us figure out how to both set appropriate boundaries for ourselves, but also keep our hearts, capable of softening and that empathy flowing, because we do need to build beloved community in this time. That's
And
the only thing that's going to save us.
I honestly think that, we are never given more than what we can bear. But there is a leveling up that our species really requires in order to build the tools to manage, climate instability and climate catastrophe. And I always
Mm,
think about Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Mud, No Lotus. And,
mhm,
what does the ability to train ourselves to transform our suffering allow us to open into stronger, more resilient versions of ourselves, ready for volatile times? And, I always remember him talking about what it meant to be a socially engaged Buddhist and that choice they had to make. Do we meditate in the monastery, or do we meditate and care
yeah,
for the people where bombs are falling?
yeah.
Bombs are falling every day for us now. So how
Absolutely.
are we going to turn our consciousness into diamonds, like precise instruments that are able to be centered in the flow of chaos, but allow us to hold the door open for many to pass and to be able to be partners in reintegration so that we can create that container that we need to move past this tremendous challenge to our species and the planet. So
Right.
I think that there is a reason why we're going through all of this, but not all of us are metabolizing the lesson, because you got to do
Right.
the work, right?
And we're not going to all do it at once. So, this is why a lot of love and some patience and community is going to be essential. But I love the way you're inviting us in to a conversation based on your own experience and this particular oppression, uh, for us to understand what it means to level up and what it might mean for us. Think about what it might mean for us to be a part of this moral imaginative revolution.
Yeah.
There's one last question that I want to bring in. All right, for those of us who are not safe, not safe in our families or communities, how can we find or build safety elsewhere without perpetuating the harms we grew up experiencing?
Well, I
Mm,
think that that is such a poignant question.
it's very poignant.
And, I just want to offer care and healing to the person that asked that. And
Hmm.
also, just be assured that everyone here in this space is holding that container for you to be opened to the possibilities of where you might find healing. But I would say that this is a really powerful time in which I think we have learned to be more integrated across virtual devices, but we are actually extremely disconnected in our local communities because of what social distancing did and the fraying of our social fabrics in the face of the pandemic. And so I think that if you are trying to build chosen family, I think one of the things that you have to do, and it can be really hard if you're introverted, is you've got to put yourself into communities where you can begin to build relationships that are ethical around shared interests of healing and community practice. So it could be going to a community sangha, it could be going to like one of Rhonda's great workshops that she has and her communities practice. It
Mhm.
might be, attending workshops that help you look at different systems of exclusion. It's basically about putting yourself into a realm of discomfort where you're learning and building new interests and ideas with people that are also sharing ideas of healing and intellectual development around systems of exclusions. And sometimes when you do that, it's a total failure. Like, I've totally gone to like spiritual gatherings or political gatherings, and I have no chemistry with anybody there. And I'm like, I never want to be there again. And it brings up all my old wounds of being bullied or just not fitting in or feeling like the awkward one. But I want to guarantee you that, that process of building building community is also a process of being a seeker. You're looking for your fellow soulmates, people who want to build beloved community with you. And when you do your inner work, when you're grounded and you're ready to receive and be a container, you know your boundaries and the containment that you need to have for yourself, you start to bring other people in your life who will mirror that same energy.
Mhm.
I'm really proud of you that you know the places you should not go, because that's actually a very difficult lesson for many survivors to learn. And they keep
Mhm.
trying to make dysfunctional, places not work for them. But the fact that you already know what is inappropriate means that you can create and basically clear the path for that opening for what
Yeah.
will be in resonance with you.
It's such a powerful place for us to draw this conversation to a close, recognizing the vulnerability in that question, the insight in that question, right? The fact that we all have fears born of these oppressions, and they can lead us to actually, if we're not careful, perpetuate what we know we have suffered. I think, intending not to be a part of the harm, intending to build community, having that view, that's our commitment, is really an important first step. So I just really want to honor everybody who's come together here,
Yes, yes, yes.
right? With that sense of something drew you into this conversation, honor that. And I really thank you, my dear Thenmozhi. Your writing has been an inspiration. Our friendship has
Mhm.
even more so, I would say, because we are in this together. And I thank everybody who is here on our call, because I feel that same sense of friendship near and far for all of us who in our different ways are learning and growing together. Thank you so much. And I want to turn it over to Alex, who has one last thing to say as we close this session out.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this very same link and later on our Facebook page. We will also be featuring this talk on our podcast, which you can find at CIISpod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us and have a great night.